Good morning, everybody. Okay, so finishing up part 1 of Invention of Wings discussion. Okay, so a couple of things. One, what was the workhouse? Actually, it's more than a couple things. It's a lot of things. So what was the workhouse? Okay. That comes into play later on in section 3, I think. So in what ways did Mama Charlotte rebel? And before teaching the colored Sunday school class, how did Sarah feel about teaching the class? I thought it was an interesting quote. He said, this was interesting to me. He said, our pew, which Father rented for $300 a year, was a mere 3 rows from the altar. The idea, it was just a side note, the idea of paying for your pew. I just thought that was funny. How did the slaves act in church? I did think it was interesting, and I'd always known this, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit. I don't know in y'all's class or not, but some of my other classes we've talked about how slavery was justified by using the Bible. I do think this is interesting because in the civil rights movement, when blacks and whites weren't allowed to marry, the Bible was used then as well, and then we have it again now. So it's just an interesting dynamic that you could see the progression of civil rights or rights movements and things, and people backing it up biblically. She says, if everyone was so keen to Christianize the slaves, why weren't they taught to read the Bible for themselves? And then, what was Charlotte's punishment for stealing the green silk? What was used to symbolize wings on the quilts that Charlotte and Handful made? What does it mean when people say that Handful is on the far side of brown? And that's on page 52 if you need to go back and kind of look at it. What is Sarah's plan to help get Handful free? How many words was Sarah and Handful's goal that they would celebrate with tea later on? And then what was Sarah's punishment for teaching Handful to read and write? And what was Handful's punishment for learning how to read and write? Who did Sarah think tore up the document freeing Hetty? Remember whenever she was first given Hetty, when she was younger, she went to her father's office and found a document and basically made the same document freeing Hetty. And then she found it the next morning, tore up at the entrance of her door into her bedroom. So who did Sarah think wrote that? And then what was the reality? Who actually wrote that? And what did that mean to her? I think we get a lot of male-female, the way that the female is treated, not only the way that the African Americans or the slaves were treated, whether they were free black men and slaves. We get a lot of how they were treated. However, we also get a lot of the way women were treated during this time period. So we can look at, the father said, how are you able to disobey with such ease and disregard? I fear the answer is you are a coddled girl who does not understand her place in the world. And then she also goes on a little bit further to say, she says, I saw my father as he really was, a man who valued principle over love. Later on, her mother said, every girl must have an ambition knocked out of her for her own good. We kind of get the perception of the mother very early on is a very negative perception. But as we go along, that perception changes. So is she 100% insensitive? How do we know that she's not 100% insensitive? How does Sarah's view of her mother change as time goes on? And why does it change? And then what does Sarah do with the silver button? The silver button comes up a ton in the book. And it is symbolic. What is it symbolic of? When Charlotte came up missing, where did Tom Fry and Handful say her mother must have been? And they said this in order to keep her mother from getting in trouble. After having her ambitions crushed, What does Sarah ask of her mother? Sarah said it would become the purpose of her life. So that pretty much ends part 1. That's the page 33 through 84. You could pair that with the previous one, and then I'm going to do more for some of the other parts as well. So good luck reading. Enjoy. Hope you are enjoying the book as much as I love the book. And maybe it'll encourage you to read some of the other Sumont Kids works. Bye!